They told themselves it was just a rumor. A whisper passed between towns, lowered voices on front porches, a story no one ever wrote down because writing it would make it real. But buried in the soil of America, beneath census records, church registries, and forgotten graves, there is a family whose story was never meant to survive. A family America looked at and then chose to look away from. This is not a story about monsters born in darkness. It's a story about people, flesh and blood, who lived, breathed, suffered, and were quietly erased while the world kept moving forward. And once you hear it, you'll understand why it was ignored. And in the early years of the 20th century, there were places in America that did not belong to the modern world. Isolated valleys, mountain hollows, backwoods communities where roads ended and rules dissolved. Places where families did not leave, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. Generations were born on the same land, buried in the same ground, married within the same bloodlines. Outsiders called it tradition, authorities called it inconvenient, and the families themselves called it normal because they had never known anything else. And this family lived in one of those places. Cut off not just by geography, but by silence. They appeared in records only when the government had to acknowledge them. Birth certificates with familiar surnames repeating again and again, marriage licenses that raised eyebrows but were still stamped and filed, medical notes written in careful language that avoided judgment. Doctors noticed things they didn't fully explain. Teachers noticed children who struggled to speak, to focus, to understand lessons designed for a world they would never enter. Social workers came, took notes, and left. Nothing changed, and over time, the physical signs became harder to ignore. Faces that looked eerily similar across generations, eyes that didn't quite align, limbs that carried the quiet markers of inherited damage. But the deeper wounds weren't visible. They lived in the way children learned fear early, in the way adults aged fast, in the way the family seemed trapped in a loop that no one outside was willing to break. This wasn't one bad decision repeated. It was a system: poverty, isolation, neglect, feeding on itself decade after decade. And what makes this story disturbing isn't just the inbreeding, it's the indifference. Because this family didn't hide. They existed in plains. Neighbors knew. Local officials knew. Even journalists on occasion knew. But every time the story surfaced, it was quietly pushed back down. Too uncomfortable, too complicated, too easy to dismiss as their problem. America was busy telling itself a story of progress, of moral superiority, of modern values. This family didn't fit that narrative, so they were left behind. And children were born into bodies already marked by decisions made long before them. They inherited not only damaged DNA, but the consequences of everyone else's silence. Some never learned to read. Some never learned to speak clearly. Some never left the land they were born on, not even once. When help did arrive, it often came too late, or in the wrong form. Institutions instead of understanding, separation instead of support. Families were broken apart not to heal them, but to hide the evidence. And there is something uniquely American about this kind of forgetting. The ability to draw borders around suffering and pretend it doesn't exist, to label it as rural, backward, or fringe, and therefore irrelevant. But this family wasn't a footnote. They were a mirror, a reflection of what happens when a society decides some lives are easier to ignore than to fix. And if you listen closely to the fragments that remain, interviews, medical notes, faded photographs, you can hear the same theme repeating: confusion, loneliness, a sense of being watched but never help. Some members of the family reportedly believed the world beyond their land was a myth. Others knew it existed but felt it was never meant for them. They grew up with the quiet understanding that they were different, and that difference was something to be ashamed of, even if they didn't know why. And this is how horror works in real life. Not with sudden violence, but with slow erosion. With systems that fail quietly. With suffering that becomes normalized because it's inconvenient to address. This family didn't ask to become a symbol of genetic collapse. They became one because no one intervened when intervention could have changed everything. And as we move deeper into this story, the details will become more specific. Names will repeat, patterns will emerge, and the question will start to press heavier on your mind. How many people had the chance to stop this and didn't? And more unsettling still, how many other families like this existed, hidden just well enough that history never bothered to remember them? And this is only the beginning. What comes next isn't just about bloodlines and biology. It's about responsibility, denial, and the quiet cruelty of looking away. And to understand how this family reached the point where their own blood became a prison, you have to go back before anyone was counting. Before doctors, before social workers, before anyone bothered to ask questions. You have to go back to the moment isolation stopped being temporary and became permanent, and the land they lived on was never meant to sustain generations. It was chosen out of necessity, not hope. Steep terrain, poor soil, winters that punished mistakes. The first settlers arrived with little more than survival in mind, carving out a life where few others wanted one. In those early years, marrying within the community wasn't taboo. It was practical. There were no nearby towns, no easy roads, no steady flow of newcomers. You married who was there or you didn't marry at all, and at first, no one noticed the cost. The human body is resilient, and early generations absorb the damage quietly. But genetics doesn't forget, it keeps score. And with each close circle, each cousin marriage, each repeated pairing of the same bloodlines, the risk grew heavier. What began as adaptation slowly turned into entrapment, and by the time the outside world started paying attention, the pattern was already deeply set. Census records show the same surnames clustered together, generation after generation, rarely branching outward. Church logs reveal marriages that raised quiet concern but were never refused. The community protected itself by staying silent. Silence kept outsiders away. Silence kept judgment at bay. Silence kept the family intact, even as it broke them, and children were born into homes where education was limited and opportunity non-existent. Many didn't attend school consistently, if at all. Some were teased when they did. Others were pitied. None were truly understood. Teachers reported learning delays, behavioral issues, difficulties with speech and comprehension. These reports went into files. Files went into cabinets. Cabinets stayed closed. And medical professionals saw signs they recognized but rarely confronted directly. Congenital conditions, developmental disabilities, repeated anomalies that pointed to a shared cause. But diagnosing the problem meant acknowledging the root, and acknowledging the root meant opening a door no one wanted to walk through. Rural medicine in those days was about treating symptoms, not systems. A child's struggles were chalked up to poverty, to poor nutrition, to bad luck. The deeper truth stayed buried, and inside the family, the effects were impossible to ignore. Parents noticed that some children were different from birth. They struggled to crawl, to walk, to speak. Some never fully developed independence. Care fell to siblings who were barely capable themselves. Responsibility came early. Childhood ended fast. And because this was all they had ever known, it felt inevitable. Like fate, not failure. And there's a quiet cruelty in inevitability. When suffering feels predetermined, resistance feels pointless. The family learned to expect loss. Infants who didn't survive, adults who aged too quickly, minds that never fully formed. Each generation inherited not only weakened genetics, but a learned helplessness that settled into their bones. And the outside world noticed only when things became too visible to ignore. A journalist passing through, a concerned official, a researcher looking for examples to study rather than people to help. When attention came, it was brief and often exploitative. Photographs were taken, notes were scribbled, labels were assigned. Then the outsiders left, carrying stories while the family stayed behind with the consequences. And what's disturbing is how often help arrived wearing the wrong face. Instead of investment, there was removal. Instead of support, there was separation. Children were taken from parents who loved them but lacked resources. Adults were institutionalized, not because they were dangerous, but because they were inconvenient. The system didn't aim to heal the bloodline, it aimed to make it disappear from view, and then still, the cycle continued. Because removing individuals doesn't break a system, it just thins it out temporarily. Those who remained carried on, forming relationships within the same narrow circle, repeating patterns they didn't have the language or power to change. The idea of leaving was more terrifying than staying. The world beyond their land might as well have been another planet, and over time the family's reputation hardened into legend. Locals whispered warnings. Children dared each other to approach the property. Adults spoke in half sentences, careful not to say too much. The family became a cautionary tale stripped of empathy, a symbol of what happens over there, far from normal life. Distance made judgment easier. Proximity made responsibility unavoidable, so most chose distance. And this is how a family becomes ignored, not all at once, but gradually. With every excuse, with every file closed, with every uncomfortable conversation avoided. By the time the consequences are undeniable, it's easy to say it's too late. Easier still to say it was never your problem. But it was always a problem. Not just of genetics, but of neglect. Not just of isolation, but of a society that allowed isolation to rot into decay. The bloodline didn't collapse in secret. It collapsed in full view of a nation that decided looking away was simpler than stepping in. And as we move forward, the story grows darker. Because the damage wasn't limited to bodies. It reached into minds, into relationships, into the very idea of identity. The question stopped being how this happened, and became what it was ever allowed to stop at all. And by the third generation, the damage was no longer subtle. It announced itself in ways that could not be explained away by poverty or bad luck. Faces carried familiar distortions, as if molded from the same flawed template. Speech patterns repeated, slow, slurred, uncertain. Learning came with visible strain, and sometimes not at all. But what haunted observers most wasn't what they could see. It was what they sensed, a fragility beneath the surface, a sense that this family was living on borrowed time, biologically and socially, and inside the home. Love existed, but it was shaped by limitation. Parents did the best they could with what they had, which often wasn't enough. They passed down stories that blurred truth and myth, explanations that tried to make sense of why some children were touched, while others seemed spared. Some believed it was God's will. Others believed it was a curse laid generations ago. Few ever considered that the answer lay in blood itself, because admitting that would mean admitting responsibility. And the children learned early that they were different. Not because anyone explained it to them, but because the world reacted to them differently. Strangers stared too long. Adults spoke around them instead of to them. Laughter followed them in town. Pity settled into every interaction like dust. Over time, that reaction became internalized. They began to see themselves as lesser, broken in ways they could not name. Shame became a constant companion, even when no one said a word. And relationships within the family grew complicated. Dependence replaced independence. Some siblings became caretakers for life, sacrificing their own chance at escape to tend to brothers or sisters who could never live alone. Boundaries blurred. Roles overlapped. The family became a closed emotional system, feeding on itself because there was nowhere else to go. Love and obligation tangled until they were indistinguishable, and the psychological toll was immense. Isolation doesn't just limit opportunity, it warps perception. When the same faces, the same voices, the same struggles surround you your entire life, they become the definition of normal. The idea that something could be different feels abstract, almost fictional. Some members of the family reportedly expressed fear of the outside world, not because it was cruel, but because it was unknown. Change felt more dangerous than decay. And when institutions stepped in, they often misunderstood what they were dealing with. Evaluations focused on IQ scores, behavioral checklists, diagnostic labels. The human story was reduced to data points. Decisions were made in offices far away, by people who never spent a night in that house, or watched a family try to function with half the tools everyone else took for granted. The result was often trauma layered on top of trauma, and being removed from the only world you know doesn't feel like rescue. It feels like punishment. Some family members placed into care or institutions deteriorated quickly, overwhelmed by environments that demanded skills they didn't have. Others were exploited, mocked, or neglected in new ways. The system congratulated itself for intervening, even as it failed to offer anything resembling a future, and those who remained behind absorbed the loss. Empty beds, unanswered questions, a growing sense that anyone who left, voluntarily or not, never truly came back. This reinforced the belief that staying was safer even as staying guaranteed the continuation of the cycle. Fear became a binding force stronger than blood, and over time the family's internal narrative hardened. Outsiders were dangerous, questions were threats. Curiosity led to separation. Silence, once a survival tactic, became doctrine. Children learned not to talk about home. Adults learned not to ask for help. The walls weren't just physical. They were psychological, built brick by brick out of mistrust and resignation. And this is where the horror deepens. Not in grotesque imagery, but in inevitability. In the realization that once a system like this is established, it sustains itself with terrifying efficiency. Genetics weakened bodies. Isolation weakened minds. Neglect weakened hope. Each element reinforced the others, creating a loop that was nearly impossible to escape without outside intervention. And outside intervention rarely came in time, or in the right form. And what was lost across these generations can't be measured. Potential erased before it could be tested. Lives defined by limitation instead of choice. A family slowly reduced to a case study, a warning, a whispered story, never a priority. And yet the question still lingers. At what point does observation become complicity? How many reports, how many photographs, how many whispered conversations does it take before ignorance is no longer an excuse? And because by now this wasn't a secret, it was an open wound everyone pretended not to see. And by the time the fourth generation came of age, the family was no longer just surviving inside the cycle. They were defined by it. The outside world had begun to attach words to them, clinical words, cruel words, words spoken quietly but meant to explain everything without fixing anything. Those words traveled faster than help ever did. And once a family is named instead of understood, their fate is usually sealed. And records from this period grow colder, less descriptive, more detached. Human lives reduced to observations. Low functioning. Unfit. Chronic. The language creates distance, and distance makes neglect easier. The family stopped being seen as individuals and started being treated as a condition. Something to be managed, not healed. Something to be documented, not rescued. and within the household, exhaustion replaced denial. Caregivers aged quickly under the weight of responsibility. Imagine waking up every day knowing your life will be spent keeping someone else alive, safe, and calm, without training, without money, without relief. Some family members never married, not because they didn't want to, but because there was no room for anything beyond survival. Others did marry within the same narrow circle, not out of desire, but out of inevitability, and love still existed, but it was heavy. It came with fear. Fear of what the next child would inherit. Fear of outsiders discovering too much. Fear of losing what little stability remained. Some mothers reportedly prayed not for healthy children, but for children who would survive. Expectations shrank with each generation, until hope itself felt dangerous. And the community's attitude hardened alongside the family's decline. Sympathy gave way to avoidance. People crossed the street. Storekeepers watched closely. Rumors exaggerated what was already tragic, turning real suffering into something grotesque. The family became entertainment in whispers, a story to scare children, a shorthand for what happens when people fall too far behind, and yet the same community continued to benefit from the family's silence. No protests, no demands, no uncomfortable questions for local leaders. As long as the family stayed where they were, out of sight, out of mind, the system could pretend it was functioning, and there were moments when change seemed possible. A concerned official, a doctor who lingered too long over his notes, a teacher who tried briefly to intervene. But systems don't move on concern alone, they move on pressure. And there was never enough pressure to force real action. Each attempt faded, absorbed by bureaucracy, drowned in excuses about funding, jurisdiction, and personal responsibility. And this is where blame becomes a convenient weapon. The family was blamed for not leaving, for not learning, for not changing. But no one asked how you leave a place when you've never been shown a path, how you learn when no one teaches you, how you change when change has only ever meant loss. And the most haunting part of this chapter isn't the physical deterioration, it's the shrinking of identity. Over time, members of the family stopped imagining themselves as part of the larger world. They were and everything else was them. The idea of citizenship, of rights, of belonging, faded into abstraction. They existed on the margins of a nation that prided itself on opportunity. And children born in this era inherited more than damaged genetics. They inherited resignation. A quiet understanding that life would be small, controlled, and observed. Some reportedly showed curiosity about the outside world. Cars passing by, voices on the radio, images in old magazines. But curiosity was dangerous. It led to questions. Questions led to attention. Attention led to separation. And so curiosity was trained out of them. Not through cruelty, but through caution. Through warnings. Through fear. The family learned to stay still. And when institutions finally acted more decisively, the motivation wasn't compassion. It was embarrassment. The family had become too visible, too well known, too hard to dismiss as an anomaly. Intervention came as containment. Measures designed to prevent further generations rather than to repair the damage already done. The goal shifted from helping people live better lives to ensuring the problem did not reproduce itself. And that shift reveals everything. It exposes a society more comfortable controlling outcomes than confronting its own failures. It's easier to stop a bloodline than to admit you abandoned it for decades. Easier to erase a future than to take responsibility for the past. And by now, the family's story was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to officials, researchers, and commentators. Their voices were filtered, translated, and often lost. They became objects of policy instead of subjects of care. And in that transformation, something essential was stripped away, their humanity. And this is the moment where the story crosses a line, where neglect becomes intervention, but intervention arrives twisted too late and shaped by fear instead of empathy. What happens next is often framed as resolution, and it wasn't. And by the fifth generation, the family existed in fragments. Not a single unit anymore, but scattered remnants shaped by decades of interference that never quite reached the heart of the problem. Some lived under supervision, some lived alone but barely. Some vanished into institutions whose names changed over time, but whose purpose remained the same, to store lives that society didn't know how to integrate. And this was the generation that felt the weight of history without understanding its origin. They sensed they were paying for something, but no one told them what the debt was. Questions about why their family was different were met with vague answers, or silence, or warnings not to dig too deep. Truth, when it appeared, arrived distorted through rumors, through cruel jokes, through the cold language of officials who spoke as if the past were already decided, and the psychological damage reached its peak here. Identity fractured. Some members tried desperately to prove they were normal, pushing themselves into environments that overwhelmed them. Others withdrew entirely, shrinking their lives to a few rooms, a few routines, a few familiar faces. Hope became unstable, appearing briefly, then collapsing under the weight of reality, and what's rarely discussed is how intervention reshaped relationships. When the state steps into a family, it doesn't just change logistics, it changes trust. Parents feared authorities. Children learned that love could be overridden by paperwork. The idea that someone else could decide your fate at any moment created a constant, low-level terror. Compliance became survival, and instill, the public narrative simplified everything. The family was discussed as a warning, as an example, as something that happened back then, or over there. Very few asked what it felt like to be born into a story already written, into a body already judged, into a lineage already condemned, and some members reportedly expressed guilt, not for what they had done but for who they were, as if their existence itself was a mistake. That kind of guilt is corrosive. It eats away at self-worth until the idea of a future feels undeserved. Dreams became modest, then non-existent. Survival was the ceiling, and if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? And because that question isn't hypothetical, it's moral. It forces you to confront whether you believe suffering like this is inevitable or allowed, whether you would fight a system stacked against you or retreat into silence the way so many before you did. And by this point, the family's story was being quietly closed. Officials spoke of resolution. Researchers moved on to other subjects. The public's curiosity faded as newer stories took its place. But resolution implies healing, and healing never truly came. And what remained were individuals carrying the echo of generations, bodies shaped by genetics, minds shaped by neglect, lives shaped by decisions made long before they could speak. The bloodline didn't end with a dramatic final chapter. It faded slowly, quietly, almost politely. And that may be the most disturbing part of all. And what lingers after a family fades isn't silence. It's residue, traces left in records and memories, in the uneasy feeling that something was handled but never truly faced. By the time the story reached its unofficial end, there were no headlines, no public reckoning. Just a quiet agreement that it was over, that the problem had been solved by attrition, but nothing about this was solved. And the last known members of the family lived lives defined by supervision and limitation. Their days were structured, monitored, reduced to routines meant to prevent harm rather than enable growth. Safety replaced freedom. Stability replaced possibility. And while those goals sound humane, they came with a cost. The final surrender of agency. Decisions were made for them, not with them. The narrative was complete, and they were expected to accept their roles inside it. And what's chilling is how easily society accepted this ending. There was relief in believing the bloodline would no longer continue. Relief in believing the story no longer needed attention. Relief in closing the file. That relief exposes something uncomfortable. It suggests that containment felt like justice. That prevention felt like compassion. That erasure felt like resolution. And no one gathered to ask what should have been done differently. No inquiry examined how many chances were missed. No public conversation acknowledged the years when intervention could have meant education, healthcare, integration, and support instead of removal and control. The story was framed as tragic but inevitable, as if it unfolded according to natural law rather than human choice. And history has a way of smoothing sharp edges. Over time, this family became a footnote, a case study, a story told with emotional distance. The individuals blurred into a single image, an abstraction that made it easier to forget they laughed, argued, loved, and hoped like anyone else. Forgetting details is convenient. Details demand accountability. And there are patterns here that repeat across American history. Isolation treated as destiny, poverty treated as character flaw, difference treated as danger. When these ideas combine, neglect can persist for generations without ever being named as violence. The family didn't just inherit damaged genetics. They inherited a national habit of looking away. And somewhere in the archives, there are photographs that were never meant to be kind, faces captured without consent, bodies frozen into evidence. Those images outlived the people they depicted, shaping how the story would be remembered. Not as a warning about neglect, but as a spectacle of decline. That choice, how a story is told, matters. It determines whether empathy survives, and the real horror isn't that this happened once. It's that it could happen again. Different location, different surname, same conditions, isolation, silence, a system that waits until damage is undeniable, then intervenes in ways that minimize responsibility rather than maximize care. And if this story feels distant, that's by design. Distance makes it easier to believe progress has solved these problems. But progress isn't guaranteed. It has to be maintained. And maintained means remembering the stories that challenge the narrative of success. And this family forces an uncomfortable question. What does a society owe its most isolated members? Is intervention only justified when it protects the majority? Or does responsibility begin earlier, when neglect first takes root, when silence first feels easier than action, and the archive may be closed, but the lesson isn't? The ground this family lived on still exists, the systems that failed them still operate, and the instinct to ignore what makes us uncomfortable is as strong as it's ever been. And the final truth is this: the family America ignored didn't disappear because the problem was fixed. They disappeared because it was allowed to fade from view. And that distinction matters, because fading isn't healing, it's forgetting, and in forgetting is how history prepares itself to repeat. And there is a temptation, at the end of stories like this, to look for closure, to search for a final judgment that restores balance. But real history rarely offers that comfort. It leaves you with questions that don't resolve cleanly, with unease that lingers long after the last name is spoken. And the most inbred family America ignored was never just a biological tragedy. Biology was only the surface. Beneath it was a layered failure, social, institutional, moral. A failure stretched across decades, carried by thousands of small decisions not to act, not to fund, not to intervene, not to care enough when caring would have required discomfort. And what makes this story dangerous is not how extreme it feels, but how ordinary the mechanisms behind it are. No villain stood at the center. No single law doomed them. There was only neglect repeated until it hardened into fate. That's what allows a society to live with itself afterward. When responsibility is diffuse, guilt evaporates, and if you strip away the labels, the records, the whispers, what remains are people who never consented to be symbols. Children who didn't choose their bloodline, adults who didn't choose isolation, families who adapted to abandonment because adaptation was the only option offered to them, and America prefers its horror clean and distant, contained in movies, museums, and history books with clear villains and endings. This story refuses that structure. It implicates systems still in use, attitudes still present, excuses still familiar. It asks you to confront the idea that progress doesn't erase responsibility, it increases it. And some will argue that intervention eventually came, that the cycle was stopped. But stopping something late doesn't erase the damage caused by delay. Prevention after generations of neglect is not redemption, it's damage control, and damage control doesn't honor the lives already shaped by loss. And others will say this was an isolated case, an anomaly, a relic of a less enlightened time. But isolation is never accidental. It's produced, maintained, justified. And wherever isolation exists, geographic, economic, social, the conditions that allowed this story to unfold still exist too. And the family's disappearance from public consciousness wasn't a mercy, it was a convenience. Their silence made room for a more comfortable narrative, one where the nation could move on without reflection. But reflection is the only thing that gives suffering meaning beyond spectacle. And if this story leaves you unsettled, that's appropriate. It should. Because discomfort is the beginning of awareness. Awareness is the beginning of responsibility. And responsibility is the only thing that prevents repetition. And the archive you've entered isn't closed. It's waiting. Waiting for someone to ask different questions next time. Waiting for someone to notice earlier. Waiting for someone to decide that looking away is no longer acceptable. And the most inbred family America ignored isn't just a story about the past. It's a warning about the present. About what happens when neglect becomes normalized, when silence feels safer than intervention, when a nation decides some lives are easier to forget, and you weren't supposed to find this story. But now that you have, it belongs to you too, and what you do with it, whether you dismiss it, debate it, or carry it forward, determines whether it remains history or becomes prophecy.